Good morning. My name is Dr. Devonna Mallory. I'm an associate professor of English here and the director of Strengthening Foreign Language and International Programs, part of the Title III program. And today, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, Sonia Nazario. Sonia Nazario has spent the last 20 years reporting and writing about some of the most important social issues facing our nation today. A reporter for the Los Angeles Times, she has covered stories about hunger, drug addiction, and most extensively, immigration. In 2003, her story of a Honduran boy's struggle to find his mother in the United States, Enrique's Journey, won the Pulitzer Prize for feature writing, the George Polk Award for International Reporting, and the grand prize of the John F. Kennedy Journalism Award, and the National Association of Hispanic Journalists Guillermo Martinez Marquez Award for Overall Excellence. Now a best-selling book, Enrique's Journey delivers an honest portrayal of the lives of millions of illegal immigrants. It offers readers compelling insights into the devastating effect immigration has on families from around the world and exposes the difficulties of adjusting to life, not only in the U.S., but the many countries where the bulk of our immigrants come from. So please give a round of applause and join me in welcoming Sonia Nazario.
Thank you to Dr. Mallory, to everyone in the English department, Dr. Hill and others for inviting me to speak today about this, my book and this issue, which is a huge issue here in Georgia. I lived in Atlanta in the early 80s when immigration was not a huge issue in Georgia. But in the 90s, in the 2000s, Georgia was, together with Arizona, saw the largest influx of unlawful immigrants. Those two states, of all the states in our union, now has the 7th largest undocumented population in the country. And Georgia went from about 35,000 unlawful immigrants in 1990 to about 425,000 in 2010. That's actually down from the high of 475,000 in 2007. So this has been a huge and contentious issue. About 4.4% of the population of Georgia now is undocumented, which is higher than the national average of about 4%, and has produced, Georgia was one of just 5 states to follow Arizona in passing a statewide anti-immigrant law, most of which was struck down by the courts in 2013. So I'm very happy to be here and talking about this issue, and I hope that in the Q&As afterwards, after my remarks, we can get a lively discussion going about this issue. As the child of immigrants, and those are folks who are willing to uproot and leave everything that they know and love to fling themselves out into the complete unknown. This is a very, very difficult thing to do, and we've been hearing this about Syrians doing this more recently. I thought I knew something about adversity and grit and determination. It was in my very DNA. My father's family, here they are, I think you can see them hopefully, they fled Christian persecution in Syria many, many decades ago to go to Argentina. My mother's Jewish family, they fled Poland before World War II to go to Argentina. And then as adults, my parents left Argentina, where both of them had grown up and where my father was born, for opportunity in the United States. My father, this was his day of arrival to this country, was coming as a biochemist to do early genetic mapping in the United States. I faced a whole slew of obstacles as I was growing up that really fueled that toughness that I already had in my genetic, in my genes. As a kid growing up, I mostly grew up in Kansas. I hated studying of any kind. I did not like reading books or studying anything. I admitted this recently in the largest gathering of English and social studies teachers in the country. What I much preferred doing was this, riding my horse, Blanca, and coming home just reeking of manure because it really pissed off my sister. She was a complete neatneck. My father so favored that sister. She was the straight-A student. She was the goody two-shoes, very well-behaved, and I was apparently the exact opposite of her. My father would call me the dumb jock in our family. He would say this openly to my face. And so I had a pretty powerful motivator. I was going to prove him wrong about me. Then my dad suddenly died of a heart attack. I was just 13 years old when he died. And my mother decided to take us all back when he died to live in Argentina. She didn't particularly like the United States, and this comes as a great shock to many college students. We've been taught, America is the greatest nation on earth, and surely everyone wants to live here. Well, no, she didn't feel that way. Many immigrants would prefer to live where they're from. She would say things like, people are so cold here. The neighbors don't even know each other in this country. It had a little bit to do with her inability to speak English very well. But she decided to take us all back to live in Argentina. Her timing was terrible. It was the beginning of the so-called dirty war in that country. The military was just about to take power. They would disappear, that's a euphemism for kill, about 30,000 people in the coming few years. When I was 14 and 15 years old, I lived in fear every single day because the military roamed the streets in unmarked cars, plucking people up off the sidewalks, and it didn't take much to get targeted by them. If you had a beard, they didn't like you. If you were a professor or a teacher, they viewed you as commies to be disappeared. And they certainly didn't like anyone who was advocating for a more just society. I always walked to school with my best friend in high school, because if one of us got snatched, hopefully the other one could run and tell our parents what had just happened. A 17-year-old, very close family member of mine, she was picked up, tortured, held in jail for nearly a year in very harsh conditions. And as the only American in my family, at 14, I was lobbying my congressional leaders in Kansas, trying to save her life. They killed one of my best friends. He was 16 years old. They broke every bone in his face, torturing him. One day I was walking down the streets of Buenos Aires in Argentina, and I saw just down the street from where I lived with my mother this pool of blood on the sidewalk. And I asked my mom, what happened here? And she said that the military had killed a couple of journalists. Why? I asked her, and she said, well, they were trying to tell the truth about what's going on here. I quickly understood that the military, in part, they were able to get away with doing this because people didn't really understand the magnitude of what was happening all around them. I understood that the military was willing to kill a lot of people to keep that society ignorant. And I understood that you can't have a strong democracy, whether it's there or here, and I fear what's happening to our press here, without a strong press that's willing to hold people in power accountable. I saw the power of words that day, the power of storytelling. I decided, staring at that pool of blood, and you should know that from the age of 3, I've had the nickname La Granuja, the troublemaker. So I've always loved stirring the pot. I decided to become a journalist, to hopefully become a truth teller. We returned to the U.S. Soon after that incident, and while I had many other hurdles to becoming that storyteller, I faced them head on, con ganas, as we Latinos like to say, with determination. My dad's death plunged our family. We used to be middle class, and then we were working poor. My mom had never gone beyond high school, so she went to work, 4 kids to raise, as a seamstress, minimum wage cook. At 15, I went to work bussing tables to help her pay the bills. I was a good student in my high school in Kansas, but I think because I was the only one who looked like this back then, no counselor even suggested, Sonia, maybe you should go to college. Luckily, my boyfriend did, and I ended up following him to Williams College, which is often ranked, U.S. News, the top liberal arts college in the United States. When I got there, some of you may feel this way at Albany State your first year, I felt completely overwhelmed. I had gone to a mediocre high school. I had never written a paper longer than 3 pages, and you could count on my 2 paws the number of books I had ever cracked open and attempted to read. These kids at this college, had all gone to the top prep schools in the country, Andover, Exeter. They had been writing papers since they were in diapers, it seemed to me. I mean, they had names like Muffy and Buffy. Who calls their kids these kinds of names? And it seemed to me that at least half of them were directly descended from the Mayflower. I was none of those things. I got grants, I worked, and I was one of maybe 5 Latinos on the whole campus. And I was drowning. C minuses. I feared flunking out my first year. But at some point, that determination kicked in. And I realized, you know what, Sonia, these students are no smarter than you are. They're just way more prepared. So buck up. You're going to have to work harder and find mentors to help you catch up to where they're at. I ended up graduating with honors and going back a few years ago to give the convocation at Williams College. At 21, I was the youngest reporter, I'm told, hired by the Wall Street Journal and here in Atlanta. And I was determined to tell stories that I hoped would matter in some sort of way. So I didn't want to write about business. I focused on writing about social issues and social justice issues. And people, I think, don't get enough ink in this country. Women, children, the poor, and Latinos. I became an expert in what's called fly-on-the-wall reporting. I can't stand sitting in an office calling people on the phone all day long. What I love doing instead is dropping myself right in the middle of the action that I'm trying to describe. Riot zones, crack houses, dangerous, tough places. I always envision my goal that with my readers, I want to grab them by the throat and take them on a ride inside worlds that you might not otherwise see. I think that there's an immediacy, a power in telling stories in this way if I can put you right in the middle of the action. I lack many qualities. I'm bad at a lot of stuff, but I thought I was the queen of overcoming obstacles. That is until one morning when I had a conversation with this woman, Carmen. She used to clean my house in Los Angeles, where I live, a couple of times a month. And I remember asking her that morning, Carmen, are you thinking about having any more children? I thought she just had one young son. Carmen was normally this incredibly chatty and happy woman, but when I popped that question to her in my kitchen, she went stone silent, and she started sobbing. And she explained to me that she had left 4 children in Guatemala, where she was from. She told me, kids I knew nothing about. She said, Sonia, I'm a single mother. My husband, he went off with another woman. Most days I could feed those 4 kids once, maybe twice. But at night, my children would start crying with hunger, and I had absolutely nothing to give them. I still remember how she showed me in my kitchen that morning how she would gently coax her 4 kids to roll over in bed at night. And she said, I would tell them, sleep face down so your stomach doesn't growl so much. She had left these 4 kids with their grandma in Guatemala and come north to work in Los Angeles. And she told me that she had not seen them in 12 years. Imagine that with your parents or your children. Her youngest daughter, 1 year old, still breastfeeding when Carmen had walked away. I still remember standing in my kitchen just being stunned by what she was telling me. I could not envision what level of desperation would it take for a mother to walk away from these children, go 2,000 miles north. Honestly, Carmen had no idea when or if she would see her children again. What I was seeing right there in my kitchen, and that many of you may have seen in your communities, was the quiet transformation of the face of migrants who are coming to this country. I thought of immigrants as overwhelmingly men. But today, 51% of the more than 11 million who are in this country unlawfully are actually women and children. There's been this real shift in the last 20 years. Millions of single mothers have come to this country. And in Los Angeles, where I live, one study showed that 4 out of every 5 live-in nannies has left a child behind in their home country. These women, these millions of women, like this woman heading north, are part of the largest wave of immigration in our nation's history. Between 1990 and 2010, 27 million people came here legally and not, more than any other decade in our history. Every year, 1 million folks come here legally or become permanent residents. And despite our still struggling economy, 200,000 are coming here illegally every year, and that is down by more than 3/4 from the high that we were seeing in 2007. If you look at our public schools across this country, 1 in 4 children today are either an immigrant or a child of an immigrant, and that will rise to 30% in just a few years. And by the way, here in Georgia, there are 8% of children in your schools have an undocumented parent. So it's even higher than the national average. These women told me, I'm coming to the United States and I take care of other people's children. I watch these kids that I take care of as a nanny. I watch them I take them to the park, I feed them, but I wasn't there to see my own child's first steps, to hear my daughter's first words, to be there on Christmas morning with my children. But as I started to interview a lot of these women across this country, all of them told me the same exact story. The only way, they said, that I could walk away from my kids that day, I gave them a promise. I said, Mijo, I swear I'm going to be gone 1 year, maybe 2, no more. What they didn't realize is life here in the U.S. is a lot tougher than advertised. I think they think it's going to be easier because when people phone back to their countries out of pride, they tend to puff up all the good stuff. I'm making $8 an hour. I have a car. No one in my little town has a car. What they don't say is I'm working 2 jobs. I'm stuffed in an apartment with 3 other families, struggling to pay bills here, saving to put $10,000 into the smuggler's hands to bring each of my children north. So this is a lot harder than they think it's going to be. And these separations, I found, typically stretch into 5 or 10 years and sometimes more. And these kids get desperate to be with their mothers again. So they get this idea, well, if she's not coming back for me or sending for me like she promised, I'm going to go find my mother. When I started looking at this phenomenon, and we all heard about these kids arriving at our border, these kids coming alone about a year and a half ago in large numbers, the surge of children. But this is nothing new. I started looking at this 15 years ago. I discovered that there was a small army of these children coming to the United States from Mexico, Central America, with no parent by their side making this journey and entering this country unlawfully. I found that in 2000, there were about 50,000 kids coming in this way. Back then, they were coming to work. They were fleeing abusive situations with their families. The majority were coming to, like this boy, and I saw these kids migrating just last year in Mexico, heading north. The majority before were coming to reunify with a parent who had left them behind, and I'll talk in a little bit about how there's been a radical shift in why these kids are now coming. I wrote about this army of children heading north through the true story of one boy, Enrique. His mother leaves him when he's just 5 years old in Honduras to come and work in California. And she leaves him with his paternal grandma. This was his kindergarten mugshot shortly after his mother had walked away from Enrique. And he would beg his paternal grandma every day, "When is she coming back? Is she ever coming back for me?" He told me when he was 11 and 12, on Christmas morning, he would stand at the door of his grandma's wooden shack. He'd put his hands together in prayer, and he would ask God for just one thing as his present. "Please, Lord, just bring her back to me." 11 years after his mother leaves him, he decides to set off to go and find her. And all he and most of these children have on them is this tiny scrap of paper with his mama's phone number inked on it. It amazed me on these migrant routes. I'd see these kids, they'd have that little scrap of paper, they'd hide it in the sole of their shoe, waistband of their jeans. They'd wrap it in plastic so if they had to cross rivers or it rained on them, hopefully that precious number of their mother wouldn't smudge. And he's virtually penniless, so he goes the only way he can up the length of Mexico, gripping onto the tops and sides of these freight trains that travel up the length of the country. I heard of children as young as 7 years old making this journey alone. And I would travel with this 12-year-old boy, Dennis, whose mama left him when he was 1 in Honduras, and at 12, he would cross 4 countries by himself and actually reach her in San Diego, California. I think your parents wouldn't let you go to the grocery store alone at 7 or 12. This boy crossed 4 countries. From the moment these children crossed the Suchiate River that divides Guatemala in southern Mexico from Mexico, they are hunted like animals all the way through Mexico as they try to reach the United States. They're hunted by people who are trying to rob, rape, kill them, or deport them. Most of them, they don't make it through Mexico. Something bad happens to them in Mexico, and they end up deported back to their countries, defeated by what's happened to them. And many of them, way too many of them, are killed along the way. They are torn apart by the train wheels as they travel north. By the way, Mexico is deporting more than 100,000 Central Americans a year. They face bandits alongside the rails. They face a dozen types of corrupt cops that I documented in Mexico who would stop the train, grab everyone, rob these children, rape the girls sometimes, and deport them across the southern border. They face gangsters who control the train tops in Mexico, who would roam from car to car. I'd see them, these gangsters, 10 or 20 of them on top of every train. They'd go from car to car, surround a group of migrants and tell them, your money or your life, and strip you of your clothes, any coins they could find, sometimes just for the heck of it or because they're hopped up on crack cocaine. They would throw these children down to the churning wheels below. And they face the train itself. The Central Americans are crossing Mexico illegally. They don't have permission to be there. They can't get on the train at the train stations. So they have to get on and off these trains as they're moving, which, take my word for it, I've done this, is a lot tougher than it looks. The rail beds slant at 45 degrees. For a lot of the kids, the first rung of the ladder came to their waist even higher if that train was banking away from them. So I would watch them try to pull themselves up these ladders. And unfortunately, for too many of them, it did not go well. I spent time in a shelter in the south of Mexico that's for people who are mutilated by these trains. And it's hard to describe what it's like walking into this place. It is rooms filled with people who have lost legs or feet, like Fausto did, or legs and the toes on his other foot, like this 14-year-old boy. The worst part of this journey, much worse than crossing the U.S.-Mexico border, which we hear so much about, this border, is crossing Mexico, and especially the southernmost state of Chiapas. When those kids would start doing that, they would tell me, ahora nos enfrentamos a la bestia. Now we face the beast. And this is what Enrique faces in the South. He's on top of one of these rail cars, and 6 gangsters creep up the ladder, and they throw him face down, and they start beating his face with a wooden club. They shatter his teeth. They strip off his clothes. He has no money, so they beat him even harder. One of these thugs starts to strangle Enrique with a bit of his own clothing, and he's trying to pull this away from his throat and buffer those blows that are coming right at his face. And he hears one of these thugs yell out, just throw him off the train. And Enrique's thinking in his mind, I'm going to die, and my mother, she'll have no idea what just happened to me. For an instant, that train jostles, and that noose loosens, and he's able to get to his knees and stand and fling himself off the train going 40 miles an hour. And when he finally comes to the next day, all they've left him are his underwear. He's covered in blood, eyes filled with blood. And these women tell him, go home, you're going to die trying to do this. But he steels himself to try and make this journey again. I would tell Enrique's story by doing it, all of it, myself. I met him, Enrique, when he was all the way up in Nuevo Laredo. You can see it at the top of the map. It's right across from Laredo, Texas. And I spent a couple of weeks with him there. He was sleeping out on the muddy banks of the Rio Grande. I would tag alongside him as a reporter. I'm trying to see his misery play out so I can convey it to you. And he told me everywhere he had been on his 8 attempts to get there. And after spending 2 weeks with him, I went back to Honduras, to Tegucigalpa, where he started his journey. And I went up the migrant routes, and I did the journey step by step, exactly as he had done it a few weeks before. It would take me 3 months. I'd travel 1,600 miles on top of 7 freight trains up the length of the country. And then apparently, because doing it once wasn't enough for me, I did it a second time, 3 more months. I did take many precautions. I'm not totally crazy. I got a letter from the president of Mexico saying, please be nice to this reporter. That's me on top of the train. That letter was good. It helped keep me out of jail 3 times as I traveled north. It turns out I didn't take enough precautions. I was on my first train ride, and I had spent weeks inside. Our immigration authorities have these detention jails for kids coming into this country alone. We have more than 80 of those now spread across the United States. And I'd interviewed dozens of kids in these places saying, please tell me every bad thing that can happen anywhere on that map, because Sonia wants to avoid all of it. None of them mentioned these branches in the south. It's very jungle-like in the south of Mexico that envelop the tops of the trains. This was my first train ride. It's pitch dark. I'm on top of a rounded fuel tanker. There's 100 migrants on top of this train and me. And the ones closest to the locomotive start screaming back a warning. Rama. I could not hear what the heck they were saying. This huge branch, and I'm holding on for dear life because the train bucks violently from side to side. This huge branch hit me right in my face, and it sent me sprawling back, almost off this car. I grabbed onto the rail on the top side of the car, and I pulled myself back up on top. When this train finally stopped the next day, there were 2 boys on the car behind mine. They said another boy with them swiped off by the same branch that hit me, and that he was probably dead because as this train moves forward, it produces this sucking wind under the wheels, so as you fall down, it actually pulls you right into the wheels. I had a nightmare when I returned home to Los Angeles that this gangster was running after me on top of the train. He was trying to rape me, and that's because somebody did try to grab me on the train, and I was luckily able to get away from him. I needed about 6 months of therapy to make that nightmare finally stop. I felt tense and filthy and in fear of being robbed, beaten, raped, pretty much every day on top of that train. In the South, it was so hot, I couldn't touch the train. It would burn my hands. And in the North, it was so cold. Migrants froze to death, including children, on top of this train. And I'd watch them do all sorts of wacky things on this train around me to try to keep from freezing to death. I felt at my complete breaking point on that train. I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where you told yourself, man, I can't take another minute of this. That's how I felt. But I knew when the train stopped, I could get off, I had money, I could eat a taco, I could sleep in a warm bed. I knew I was going through 1% of what these children go through who had none of those advantages. You know, the hell of the journey in southern Mexico, it really crushed my faith in humanity, what I saw. But then there were these kind people who appeared, who restored it. In Veracruz, which is in south central Mexico, wherever there's a curve in the tracks or for some reason this train has to slow down, when people in these little towns along the rails heard the whistle of the train, I would see 10 or 30 people run out of their huts with these bundles of food in their arms. I was actually with this woman last fall. She's an amazing person. I see them all come out and they would start waving and smiling and shouting out to people on top of the train with these bundles in their arms. They threw bread. They threw tortillas, they threw sandwiches, they threw whatever fruit was in season. When I was on top of the train, they were hurtling these large branches of bananas and rolls of crackers on top of me. If they didn't have food, they would give tap water. And if they didn't even have that, I'd watch them line up next to the tracks, come out of their huts, put their hands together, and they would say a prayer for these migrants as they pass by on these trains. I was so moved by this spectacle because, you know, that woman makes $1 a day. She can barely feed her children, but she was giving a little of what she had to complete strangers from other countries. And all of them told me the same thing. I'm doing this because it's the Christian thing to do. It's the right thing to do. I may not have counted the 92 references to the stranger in the Old Testament, but I know this is what Jesus would do if he were here, standing right in my shoes. People like Maria gave. She was the best part of this journey for me. Maria, I had trouble believing her at first. You know, I'm a tough investigative reporter. I started my interviewing with Maria saying, Maria, how old are you? And she said, I'm 132 years old. I'm like, uh-oh, can I believe anything this woman is telling me? She said that during the Mexican Revolution, 1910, she was so hungry she would eat the bark of the plantain tree in her front yard. Her hands were gnarled with age, but she would force them to make these little bags with tortillas, beans, salsa, and when she heard that whistle, she would give them all to her 70-year-old daughter, and then Soledad would go running down that rocky slope and heave these bags up to the migrants on top of the train. I'll always remember what she told me. If I have one tortilla, I will give half away. I know God will bring me more. Enrique makes 8 attempts over 122 days and 12,000 miles. You know, children have long gone on this modern-day odyssey, and I have to say that for many years, I thought it was enough as a reporter to educate people about the latest wrinkle in our long-running immigration saga. But recently, I have felt unable to stay on the sidelines. I have become what used to be the dirtiest word in the English language to me, because journalists we're supposed to be objective, we're not supposed to take sides, we're not supposed to express political opinions. I have become an advocate. What pushed me over the line that journalists are taught is strictly verboten. Well, in 2012, we saw 69,000 unaccompanied immigrant children apprehended by our government trying to get into the United States. It was a tenfold increase over the previous 4 years. It went down last year, but this year it looks to be on track to do the same as 2014. We're seeing a new surge in these children that you've probably read about in the newspapers. I knew this journey had become incredibly more dangerous than when I had done it. The Zetas, the most bloodthirsty narco cartel in Mexico, now controls the train tops along with these gangsters, and they are kidnapping 18,000 Central Americans every year in Mexico. These are the faces of the disappeared. They prefer to snatch children because they use that little scrap of paper with mom's phone number here in Georgia to call up mom and demand ransom, $2,000 to $5,000. And if you don't pay, they kill you. And they do it with a knife in front of all the other children to send a message to the other parents. Surveys show that 60% of girls are now being raped on this journey coming north. And Mexican morgues are receiving 4,000 unidentified bodies a year. Many are presumed to be immigrants. So I asked myself, why would any child now make this journey? And for God's sake, why would any parent allow them to make this journey? The answer is that today, and like when Enrique made this journey, it's actually safer to do this than to stay at home in places like El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, where that have the highest homicide rates in the world of countries that are not at war. They have a kill rate today that is second only to Syria. Migrant children interviewed by the United Nations said that they had been threatened once, 3 times in their home countries, and they felt like their lives were certainly in danger if they stayed home. 6 in 10 kids told the UN the primary reason now for leaving is violence in their countries, and that's up from about 1 in 10 children back in 2006, so a huge jump. The UN said these children likely merit international protection by your and my government, the US government. In the past decade, all of us as taxpayers, you're getting ready to take on your taxes right now, we've spent about $8 billion to disrupt the flow of cocaine. Those red lines are drug flights. From Latin America to the United States. We are the largest consumer of illegal drugs on earth. We use 1 in 4 illegal drugs in the world. What do the narcos do? The top map is 2007. They used to fly these flights from Colombia, Venezuela to the Caribbean and then get the drugs onto the US. So we spent all this money. What did they do? The bottom map is 4 years later. They simply rerouted to the left, and now they're landing 4 out of 5 narco flights in Honduras, a country that now has the #1 homicide rate in the world. It's 4 times the rate of Mexico. When I returned to Honduras in 2014, back to Enrique's neighborhood to report for the New York Times, I was just blown away by the level of violence that I was seeing that these kids faced every day. They were being kidnapped in his neighborhood, beheaded, they were being skinned alive. Gangs and the narcos that they report to often were forcibly recruiting children, much like child soldiers are recruited in Sudan, to serve as lookouts, to collect extortion money from businesses, to sell drugs, and yes, ultimately to kill people, to work as sicarios. We just had a movie come out by that name. I interviewed kids like Christian. This boy is 11 years old. He's in 6th grade. And he told me he knew the consequences to saying no to the narcos who controlled his elementary school in Enrique's neighborhood. Every time he came out of his elementary school, they would try to push him to start using crack cocaine. They wanted to get him hooked on crack and then working for them. He knew 3 children who had said no and had been murdered in the previous 6 months, including an 11-year-old girl who was clubbed over the head. They dragged her off, cut a hole in her throat, stuffed her panties in it, and threw her broken body in a ravine across the street from where Christian lived. The kids fleeing now are getting younger. Half of them caught in Mexico are 11 and younger, and more of them are girls. Milagro in Enrique's neighborhood told me why more are girls. She was told that she was going to be the girlfriend of the local gang leader, or she would be killed, and she would have her whole family in Honduras exterminated if she said no. As she told me that day, it's better to leave than to have them kill me right here. Today's child migrants, many of them, are a word that we're hearing used to describe Syrians. They are refugees. They are fleeing persecution. They are fleeing for their lives, and they have no viable government in their countries to protect them. Well, our congressional leaders didn't see it that way back in 2014. When the surge occurred and these kids coming, they said, they talked about this horde of criminal 6-year-olds at our border. They were all infested with Ebola, and they were trying to bring Ebola to each and every one of us. Instead of welcoming refugees, and by the way, we have signed protocols saying that as a government we will do that, and we demand that other governments do that. We have demanded that the countries around Syria take in more than 3 million refugees. President Obama went in the opposite direction. He said he was going to send all these kids back, and he's tried. This administration has pushed to roll back a 2008 law that requires that these Central American kids get a full, fair hearing before an immigration judge. He couldn't get Congress to roll back that law, so he ordered the immigration courts to put these kids' cases at the front of the immigration dockets and to ram them through so quickly that some judges will give you a week to show up with a fully developed asylum claim, something lawyers say takes at minimum a year to develop an effective asylum case. And after all the traumas these kids have already endured that I have described, we inflict one more of them on them in this country, the U.S. judicial system. We all know that if you're a murderer in the United States, or an accused murderer, you're entitled to a public defender if you can't afford a lawyer, but not if you're an immigrant, even a child like the 7-year-old that I saw shaking before an immigration judge in Los Angeles court, or the 3- and 4-year-old toddlers who were shaking in court in Alexandria, Virginia, the other day. 7 in 10, they are being asked, if they can't afford a lawyer, to present this complex asylum case to these immigration judges. Asylum law is more complex than tax law, so you can imagine asking a 4-year-old to do this who can't speak English. 7 in 10 children cannot afford a lawyer, so they're going to court alone. It is completely terrifying for them. I've seen these toddlers pee in their pants, clutch teddy bears, standing in court, shaking like a leaf, because anything they tell that judge can send them hurtling back to this danger that they've just escaped. We know that half of these, I hear from audiences, Sonia, what part of illegal don't you understand? Well, we know that half of these kids actually qualify to be allowed to stay in this country legally. But without a lawyer, they're doomed. Only 10% of them win. If they have a lawyer, 70% of them win their asylum claims. And finally, this administration asked Mexico last year to keep these kids from arriving at our border. This is why the numbers of kids went down last year. We have paid Mexico tens of millions of dollars, and this was the story I did a few months ago in the New York Times about this, to train, equip, and pay Mexico to halt these kids from arriving at our border. Mexico, that great defender of immigrants, supposedly, deported 20,000 unaccompanied Central American children in 2014, 4 times the number that it did 2 years before. It has launched a ferocious crackdown on these kids, and it's virtually impossible to ride on the trains today through Mexico. It's now detaining and deporting more Central American than the United States. The surge of these immigrants, children fleeing, has not stopped. Just as many are leaving these countries as before. It's just that they're being turned back by Mexico, a place where it's nearly impossible for a child to make an asylum claim. Well, what are the consequences of our policies? It's that 14-year-old boy, Gredis, who was sent back And within a day of being sent back to Honduras, he had 2 bullets in his head by the same gangsters who had threatened him right before he had left Honduras. The administration has proposed $90 million giving to Mexico to do more of it this year. To be clear, I don't think that all migration is good. Far from it. And I get criticized as a Latina for taking this position. I think that there are winners and there are losers in terms of this unprecedented influx of immigrants that we've seen to places like Georgia in the last couple of decades. I think we can and we should have a full-throated debate about these pluses and minuses, especially for migrants who are coming here for a better life. I call those economic migrants. Unlike many, the longer I look at this, the more shades of gray I see in this issue. Let's be clear, I think there are huge benefits to this influx. Many migrants do jobs others simply, Americans don't want to do, like that poultry plant down the road here, where, it's freezing cold and you're getting paid 10, 12 bucks an hour to do the same motion. Sometimes they won't even give you a potty break. So in these poultry plants, people wear diapers because they're not allowed to take a break and go to the bathroom. I think that there aren't enough Americans to do those kinds of jobs. Migrants help, every economist virtually will tell you, migrants help drive our $16 trillion economy. They are good for our economy. And 5% of all goods and services all of us buy in this room are cheaper because of immigrant labor. I think migrants prevent a lot of the businesses around here from closing down altogether. If that poultry plant had to pay 20, 25 bucks an hour to get an all-American workforce, could we afford chickens? Or would the producers realize Americans can't pay that for a chicken, and let's just shut down this plant and import chickens from Brazil or Argentina or somewhere else, and all that economic activity here in Georgia would go away. But there are losers, and unfortunately, they're the most socially disadvantaged in this country. The 1 in 14 Americans who don't have a high school degree, who have been forced to compete in certain industries with these migrants. Those are mostly African Americans and previous waves of Latino immigrants. And so we have seen among those folks without a high school degree up to a 7% drop in wages in the last 2 decades because of that competition. If you look at construction, 1 in 7 construction workers are undocumented. I would argue that Americans are willing to do construction jobs if they're paid a living wage to do so. And the other group that's really hurt that doesn't get discussed are migrants. If you come here as a mother and you send money back to your kids so that they can eat and study, that's huge. But it's also true if you leave your kids for 10 years, which is often the case, those kids will resent and walk up to the line of hating you for leaving them. I've interviewed hundreds, and all of them say, I would have rather had my mama by my side to love, protect me, than had her in the U.S. sending the Nike shoes, the soccer ball, and even the money to be able to eat. So these moms lose the most precious thing, which is the love of their children. I think we have to get past the same 3 tired approaches proffered by the left and the right on this issue that have been pushed for decades, that are honestly the same 3 elements of comprehensive immigration reform, to instead push to stem this exodus at its source so more migrants don't have to flee the homelands where most of them would honestly prefer to live. I think we have to acknowledge that the 3 solutions we keep trying have failed to permanently stem this flow. We've tried border enforcement on steroids. I know Mr. Trump wants to do this, many multiples of what we're already doing. We spend $18 billion a year at this, and yet 97% of people who try repeatedly to get into this country are able to do so. Walls don't work. We spent money on Border Patrol agents, and we've deported a lot of people, and it has not worked to stem the tide. We've tried guest worker programs. The problem is guest workers are supposed to come temporarily and then go home. But more than half of them in the largest program, the Bracero program, did not go home. And that created the foundation of the wave of migration that followed from Mexico. And we've tried the third approach, legalization. Well, we last did this in 1986, and it was great for people who are here unlawfully. They were able to come out of the shadows and not live in enormous fear. But we went from 3 million to 1 million. Then they told all their friends and family members, come on up, many of them illegally, and we're now at almost 12 million. I'm not good at math, but I would suggest that didn't work out as our political leaders swore that it would. Instead, I think Americans should push our government to formulate a foreign policy that brings every tool we have at our disposal, and this is just some of them, microloans, trade policies that allow in more goods from these 4 countries that are sending most migrants here. Educating girls. If you educate girls, they put off having kids till they're older. They have fewer children. If there's one thing that's reduced the flow from Mexico, it's that they have promoted family planning for 30 years, gone from 7 to 2 kids per family. That is what has reduced the rate of migration from Mexico. We need programs that strengthen and cleanse government institutions like the police and judicial system to improve governance in these countries, reduce corruption, and reduce violence so people don't have to flee. I think we should spend taxpayer money on these sorts of things rather than the $2.5 billion we poured into that useless fence. It's doable. Creative approaches are starting to move the needle in Honduras. These kinds of approaches have reduced the homicide rate 27% in the last 2 years. Let me end by saying that, when I listened to these children's stories, as I did along the train tracks last year in Mexico, last fall, there's so much that I want to ask every American to advocate for. I think we need to push for a radically different and effective approach to our drug problem in this country. If there's one thing Republicans and Democrats seem to agree on, and it's probably the only thing recently, it's that our approach of locking everyone up has been a complete failure. The war on drugs has been a complete failure, and we need to instead do more prevention, drug treatment, drug courts, all the things that some of the candidates are talking about today. I think we should lobby to increase the number of refugees that our country takes. I know Georgia is among some of the states who are saying we don't want refugees, especially from Syria. But we need to increase this, I think, from the current 85,000, it was increased to that this year, to at least 130,000, which is what we took pre-9/11, to give more children that are fleeing harm a safe harbor in this country. That dinky country in Europe, Germany, took in 1.1 million refugees this year, more than 10 times what we did. I think that's disgraceful. I wish everyone would join me also as a voice for refugee children. To me, it seems ridiculous to have to actually say it, but if a child is in danger and they're knocking at your door, you should open that door. Somehow we can get a law passed by Congress that ensures that 34,000 deportable migrants are locked up in our prison system every night, which has been a boon to the prison industry. They're very good at spending money lobbying Congress. But recently, a very laudable Obama measure, which would have given $50 million for government lawyers for these immigrant children, was shot down by the Senate. I think we have to change this, get these kids legal help, because the current system honestly just makes a mockery of our judicial system. We should give a child a real shot at staying here legally if they deserve it. I see this moment as a true test for our country. Are we going to rise to the level of humanity that's required of us? I've seen many students across this country who read Enrique's Journey take suggestions on my website of how to get involved, how to make things better. They help push our Congress to double the number of foreign aid going to Central America this year. It's a new measure, and I'm hopeful that some of that money will start to change things in Central America. I've seen them join schools. Universities have built schools in Central America, water systems. They've started microloan programs. So I've seen students like you do incredible things. I think we're capable of amazing things. things if we come together with a purpose. And I saw it recently one night in McAllen, Texas, on the border. Members of the Sacred Heart Catholic Church, they saw these dirty, scared women, immigrant women and toddlers at the local bus station right near the church. They'd just been released by the Border Patrol to go on to their destinations, to immigration court where they were going to live. And they started bringing these women and toddlers back to the church, which, as you can see, it became this impromptu relief center. Jews, Episcopalians, Baptists, everybody in this town came together to help. They faced down these anti-immigrant zealots who were at the bus station waving guns at these women and children, telling them to go home. Volunteers converged on this church from 28 states in our great union with donations. Like the parents from Pennsylvania piled a van high with clothing and food and packed their 2 kids in the car and drove all the way to the tip of Texas. And all of these volunteers say the same thing when they arrive. I was moved, and so I came. The women who walked in that night that I was there, they looked terrified. They'd often been raped on this journey, and they had been held by the Border Patrol in these ice-cold jail cells called hieleras, ice boxes, for 5 days, sleeping on the concrete floor with their children, with no shower, with not enough food, a 3-day-old baby sleeping on this concrete floor. When they walked in, all the volunteers yelled out, "Bienvenidos," welcome. And all the women started crying because it was the first time anyone in the United States had said something kind to them. Sister Norma, the righteous nun who runs this place, went to Washington, D.C., and she told House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, we are not doing anything political here. We are extending a hand, one human being to another. So I'm here today to ask, can't we all extend a hand in some way? If a girl like me, I couldn't even write a paper when I got to college, could win, of all things, the Pulitzer Prize, the highest writing award in the land, in feature writing, of all things, if the food throwers can give a little of what they have to strangers, if Enrique could make it into his mother's arms, I know that anything is possible. I know that anyone can give half a tortilla away. I believe that if we push with the determination that I saw on these trains in Mexico, we can help these refugee children get a measure of the justice that they deserve in this country. And we can bring about a new approach to our immigration dilemma to slowly and surely change things in these 4 countries in Central America. So mothers, like my house cleaner, they never have to walk away from their children again. Thank you.